Now, when it comes to enforcement, GDPR is enforced whenever a violation happens. So, a violation is anything that happens when GDPR isn't followed, not just data breaches. So, let's say your privacy policy just isn't sufficient. Let's say you don't get consent correctly. And again, this includes getting consent for cookies, like tracking cookies on your website, but it extends far beyond cookies. The other thing about consent is you have to make it easy to give and just as easy to revoke. So if you make people jump through like 3 pages of sites to decline consent, but you only have 1 page to give consent, that's not compliant. And then data breaches are also considered a violation. Now, GDPR gets enforced through 4 ways. The first is self-reported violations that are submitted by the organization's data protection officer. The second is by individuals submitting complaints to authorities, and then the authorities investigate. The third is EEA authorities have the right to audit and investigate organizations whenever they want, but with appropriate notice. And the fourth one is through fines, and that's what we'll focus on here. It's important to note, though, first off with fines, that they are administered per violation. So if in 2018 your privacy policy, let's say in like 2020, your privacy policy isn't sufficient and you get fined, that's 1 violation. And then in 2021, you weren't deleting people's data and you had a data breach, those are 2 separate violations. The way the law is written is fines are to be, quote, effective, proportionate, and dissuasive. So really GDPR is aiming to prevent the misuse of personal data. And then also be aware that member states, different countries within Europe, they are allowed to impose additional penalties for non-compliance with GDPR. So like Germany, and at the time of this writing, UK, France, Italy, Iceland, they can all, if they want, pass even more stringent penalties for non-compliance. So fines can really have a material impact or really significant impact on organizations and their bottom lines. So there are 2 types of violations, minor and major. The maximum fine for a minor violation is either 10 million euros or 2% of global revenue, whichever is greater. And note that this is a global revenue. This is not profit. This is not EBITDA. This is not Europe only revenue. This is your global revenue. And then the maximum for major violations is doubled to either 20 million euros or 4% of global revenue. So let's go through some examples really quick. This is a table I've created, and this is the maximum fine that that organizations could face based on their revenue and how severe of a violation they faced. So if you're a startup, and let's say you're bringing in a few $1 million a year in the United States, you could be subject up to a 20 million euro fine. So if you're not taking PII seriously enough, you could very easily go out of business. And for the massive global enterprises, they could have up to $4 billion fines per and remember, this is per violation. So if you have 5 violations in a year, you could face up to 100 million euro or 20 billion euro violation if you're that big. Now, let's talk about GDPR's impact. What's actually been happening? So, when it comes to fines, up until mid-2019, the average fine was $5,600 US. But then, in July, British Airways got fined $230 million, or 1.5% of their global revenue. They had, for those who are technical, they suffered from, they were hacked by MageCart. They had a JavaScript library injected into their website that scraped people's credit cards for about 2 weeks. Basically, British Airways had their website breached, and hackers were able to collect payment information and other information on people. 500,000 people were affected. So this was names, addresses, credit card, travel itineraries, and usernames and passwords. 500,000 people in relative terms of today's data breaches is actually a relatively small number. So it's important to note that even a breach that was as small as that resulted in a massive fine. That same month, July 2019, Marriott Hotels was fined $124 million for a breach that had occurred several months earlier, or was discovered, I should say. It included over nearly 400 million guest records, 24 million passports, and 9 million credit card numbers. The reason this is lower is because this affected not everybody in this breach was within the EEA. In my research, I haven't been able to find actual numbers, but that's why this breach is lower. The thing that's interesting, though, about the Marriott breach is the breach started at least in 2014 and potentially earlier than that. But the breach happened at Starwood Hotels, and Marriott acquired them 2 years earlier in 2016. This is important to note because if your organization plans on acquiring another organization, you will be held liable for their security. And so if they have a data breach, if they're not following GDPR, that's a liability that you're going to have to incur. So as you take your risk management, as you do your risk management, take careful note of this, as well as all the other concerns we've talked about. In response to these announcements, because these were both announced 2 days in a row, EEA officials stated that because personal data has real value, just like any other asset, they are not going to hesitate in taking strong action when needed to protect the rights of the public. So going forward, while there will be some small fines for minor violations, this is speaking in likelihood, note that it's highly likely these massive multi-million-dollar fines are going to continue. And so as your organization is processing data, considering what markets to target, be sure to take the risk of GDPR and other things into account. And one thing to note is it's better to invest money into a good, robust security program with appropriate people there than it is to just have nothing in place and just go for it. That's my opinion and my observation. And so just be sure that your company has appropriate security personnel in place. We'll talk about this later, but privacy laws are being enacted all over the world. And the days of just being able to have a startup or a company where security was a third-tier priority for almost any company really doesn't exist anymore. It has to be top of mind, and one of the top it needs to be an executive level top priority. So, in my observations, I've found that security standards at organizations are driven largely by the threat of losing money. Now, this isn't necessarily a bad thing. Everybody has limited resources, limited money, and so you have to, as individuals and as organizations, we have to choose what we want, where we want our money to go. And so as the costs of having a security or privacy issue have increased, and the costs of that have increased, organizations are much more willing to invest. Like, let's say an organization faces the threat of a $100 million fine. They're going to invest, say, $10 million in order to have a robust security program in place that can prevent that $100 million fine. So that's just an example. But money can be lost both from the data breaches. So, you have to respond to, you have to remediate that. IBM, I believe it was IBM, did research that showed that the average breach in 2019 cost $3.5 million to remediate and to address. That's just fixing it. That doesn't include any future costs or any other costs like fines from regulations or lost sales, both from current clients or potential clients or customers. Like we said, GDPR's potentially huge fines are driving a lot of change. In the recent years, security standards have just increased across the board, from startups to massive enterprises. Like we talked about, investing money now into a security program to ward off a huge fine is generally what companies are choosing to do. The other reason that security standards are increasing is organizations are required to make sure that their vendors that are processing PII are compliant with GDPR, as well as their vendors' vendors. So you're seeing not just third-party, but fourth-party risk being required by GDPR. And so companies that are further down the supply chain are, I guess this isn't supply chain, but just there's a rippling effect where organizations, even if they're not based in Europe or normally wouldn't care about GDPR, if one of their clients or customers does, they then have to care about it. And so you're just seeing a lot of change. There have been some unintended consequences, though, that weren't foreseen with GDPR, primarily through identity theft and as well as stalkers. So what some organizations are seeing are imposters who request info under others' identities. So if your organization receives a request from an individual to have they want all of their data downloaded, some stalkers are doing that to get, say, private photos or to get financial information of individuals. This includes both stalkers, bounty hunters. So bounty hunters are known to get location data. Identity thieves are a big one. So what organizations really need to do is they need to better validate a person's identity. Otherwise, giving information about Alice to Bob in an unauthorized manner is going to count as a data breach. So just make sure that you're validating people's identities. And in my opinion, there probably also needs to be a centralized mechanism to verify identities, potentially. So anyways, this is complex, but just make sure that you're taking steps to reasonably ensure that you know that the person who's making the request is that person. And then lastly, where are these laws heading? Many countries already have laws in place. So we're also going to include standards. So PCI is technically a standard. But there's GDPR, there's the United States, there's HIPAA, and California's Privacy Act. Russia has their own that's pretty stringent. Each of these countries have their own, and many more already have some in place, and more are coming. It seems like at least once or twice a month there's some sort of new regulation that gets passed, and so it's coming. And going forward, information security and privacy, they're only going to become more complex than they already are. So for example, the majority of US states have their own individual security and privacy laws that have their own requirements. The good news is that those requirements tend to overlap a lot, but you still have to follow them. And then more countries are going to have laws in place. And it's important to note that some of these laws are going to be influenced by geopolitics. This is just a fact of the matter. We're starting to see the internet start to become segmented. Some people use the term balkanization or balkanized. And so just know as world events happen, laws and regulations are going to change. And then along with all this, the need for InfoSec professionals is really increasing. Organizations, because the risks have increased so much, in order to mitigate those increased risks, organizations need to do more to address those risks, and that includes hiring security professionals. And so if you're interested in this field, it's a great field. I love it. But along with this, so if you want to, it's a great field. You can have a good income. If you're an organization, also recognize that the pay for security professionals is increasing. So, for example, a chief information security officer in California was making $600,000 in 2016, and after GDPR came into effect, their salary quadrupled at the same company. So it's, as things become more complex, it's requiring more experience, more understanding, and there's also a shortage of security professionals. Another thing is, as an organization, be willing to train people. In the industry, I've seen that most jobs require 3 to 5 years of experience, but it's impossible to get those 3 to 5 years of experience without job experience, but they're not going to hire you because you don't have job experience. So it's kind of this bad cycle. And so as an organization, really consider being willing to take on somebody who has a passion for this and has shown that, and be willing to train them, even if they aren't necessarily very skilled. They can become skilled, and it's a community with a lot of resources, a lot of people, who are willing to help. So yeah, and then how does this impact you? So like we've basically said, regulations are going to affect all types of businesses. Some startups have to worry about GDPR, some don't, but there are going to be more laws that are also going to require more stringent security standards. And so if you're starting a business or you're going to launch a new product, be sure to consult with legal counsel as well as your company's security/privacy teams, just to make sure that you're addressing those risks, you're aware of them, and you're able to make informed decisions. Because the last thing any of us want to do is make a decision and turns out that there was something we didn't know existed, or some term and condition, or some risk, and then we end up in a worse spot than we were before. So this is just something to keep in mind. We've talked about this, so if you're in the training, or you're watching this, really consider a career in InfoSec. We need we need people who are ethical and have integrity. And if you are interested, it is possible to get into this field. It does require some work at the moment, but get an internship or work experience. Take that low-level position, or if you're more experienced, like you've been a programmer for a long time, or you've been an auditor for a long time, it's a lot easier to make that jump. Also, get certifications. This industry cares a lot about certifications, even more so than college degrees, generally speaking. Like Security Plus is a great one to get. Do personal projects, network with people, and then here in Utah, there's a hackerspace here. All right, so in review, today we talked about the basics of GDPR, and the goal of this is to enable you to meaningfully contribute to GDPR-related discussions. So talked about where GDPR came from, where it applies, its rules, and how it's enforced, as well as its impact. And we also briefly talked about the future of privacy regulations. And then we talked about how all this impacts you, primarily from the viewpoint of an organization, but there are also some takeaways from this as an individual. So thanks for taking the time to watch this. If you have any questions, please reach out to me. These are links that you can use to get a hold of me, or leave a comment in the description below, and I'll be more than happy to chat with you. So thanks for taking the time to watch this, and don't forget to leave a like and subscribe. So have a great day. Bye.